through some definitions, the bill process, and some kind of quirks of the process, and then we will hold Q&A until the end, so apologies for that. Like that, but here are some definitions. It looks like my PowerPoint kind of shows up a little funky, so apologies for that. But Kansas is one of most states with part-time legislature, so we're in session from generally January to May. Sometimes we end a little early and sometimes we go into June, and there's a bit of a break in April. We are also bicameral, so we've got the upper chamber, which is the Senate, and then the lower chamber, which is the House, and bills have to go through the entire bill process in both chambers in order to get to the governor's desk. And as you can see, Republicans have a majority in both the House and the Senate, and we have one independent in the state legislature. I'm not sure where that little 5. Oh, because it's supposed to say 125. Okay. About the tech issue. So within each chamber, there is leadership, and then there is, in each party, there is leadership within each chamber. So within each chamber, the majority party is in leadership, and then the minority party also has their leadership. So they have elections at the beginning of sessions to determine the people who will assign people to committees. Majority leadership assigns bills to committees and determines what's heard on the House and Senate floor, so what bills can get voted on and discussed. And because of that, there are some policies and pieces of legislation that the minority party would prefer to be discussed and doesn't necessarily get onto the House or Senate floor. And sometimes people will try to amend those pieces of legislation so that they can have a discussion. An example that always comes up is Medicaid expansion, but so far that strategy is not very. So current Senate leadership, we've got the President of the Senate, Ty Masterson, the Senate Majority Leader, Larry Alley, and the Senate Minority Leader, Dinah Sykes. And then over in the House, we've got the Speaker, Dan Hawkins, Speaker Pro Tem, Blake Carpenter, and the House Minority Leader. So the start of the process is committees, which are small groups of lawmakers that are assigned by, again, House and Senate leadership to work on bills within those specific subject areas. For example, there are tax committees, there are education committees, agriculture committees, budget committees, and more. The majority member will have more members on each committee, but there's a specific number of minority members required based on legislative rules. And within each committee, leadership positions are the chairperson and the vice chairperson, both of whom will be Republicans in Kansas, and the ranking minority member, who is the highest ranked Democratic member on a committee. Okay, so an example of the bill process, starting with some key deadlines. By mid-February, most bills, so bills introduced by individual lawmakers or bills introduced by most committees, have to be introduced. There are certain exempt committees that don't have to be subject to most of these deadlines, but for everyone else, they've got to be introduced by then. By the end of February, which is called turnaround, that is the deadline for all of those bills that had to be introduced by mid-February to have gotten through their whole process in their chamber of origin. So if a bill starts in the House, in a House committee, it has to have gone through the committee, onto the House floor, and been voted and passed on the House floor in order for it to stay in the process. And then at the end of March, which is first adjournment, is the deadline for those same bills to have been gone through the whole process again on the second side of the second chamber. So if we have an example of a House bill, it can be introduced in committee by, it can be a committee-sponsored bill. An individual lawmaker can have introduced and sponsor the bill. And then the House leadership would assign that bill to a committee. So they would determine which committee is most relevant to the subject matter of the bill and assign it to that committee. And then within the committee, each committee has different rules for how people or organizations can provide testimony, which is one of the big ways that people can have their voices heard and explain why they support or oppose or are neutral on a piece of legislation. For example, I often provide testimony in a committee that is the House Committee on Welfare Reform on things like SNAP and usually at least one day, at least 24 hours after a committee has a hearing on a bill, they will, quote, work the bill, which means that lawmakers on the committee will discuss the bill. They will discuss how the hearing went, different pieces of testimony that were offered. People can offer amendments, which the committee then has to vote on. And then the committee will vote on the bill. And usually chairs don't vote, but often will if they need to break a tie. And a bill can be reported favorably for passage by the committee, which means that it moves on to the next step in the process and goes to that bill's entire chamber. So in our example case, it would go to the House, where it would be, quote, under the line, which means that the House leadership can at any point pull it above the line, which means that that day they will be talking about the bill on the House floor. And that action on the floor is kind of similar to what happens in committee. One lawmaker carries the bill, presents the bill to their chamber, talks about what happened in committee, talks about any amendments that the committee made, and then other members are able to ask questions, offer amendments that have to be voted on by the entire chamber, and then the bill will be put to a vote, and it's either voted up or down by the entire House floor, and then it will move over and start the whole process over on the Senate side in the Senate's relevant committee. Sometimes, though, there are what are called companion bills, which is the basically exact same piece of legislation going through the House and the Senate at the same time. And what that does, if it gets through both chambers clean, meaning there are no amendments, no changes to what the language is in both chambers, then it basically just makes the process go a little bit faster, because instead of having to go through the whole process again, it already has. And if a bill gets through this whole process, it then can go to the governor's desk, where the governor can either sign the bill into law, veto the bill, or allow it to become law without her signature. So if a bill is amended, if the originating chamber, so in our example, the House amends the bill, either in committee or on the floor, then that is that bill's official current form. But if our bill gets through the House and then gets into the Senate, and the Senate committee and or the Senate floor amends the bill, there are competing versions of the bill, which means that the bill has to go through the conference committee process. Conference committees are joint committees of Senate and House that usually are made up of the chair, vice chair, and ranking minority member of the two relevant committees that addressed the bill in each chamber. And those chambers' representatives on conference committees are there to represent their chamber's position on the bill, the version that they ended up with. And conference committees sometimes have to meet only once, sometimes they have to meet several times over several days to come to a compromise. And there's usually a conference committee week when all kinds of conference committees are going on at the same time, because there are a lot of these bills that have been changed by the second chamber that the other chamber doesn't like. So they have to meet and go back and forth until they can come up with, or sometimes they don't come up with anything. And again, the conference committee process, those appointments are made by chamber leadership. And so once a conference committee has come to their compromise, that what is now called the conference committee report goes to the second chamber for an up or down vote. That chamber says, yes, we're okay with this. It then moves right over to the originating chamber for that same up or down vote. But if at any time either chamber votes it down, it goes back to the conference committee process, at which time chamber leadership can appoint new conferees if they see fit. But there always has to be 2 people in the majority party and 1 person of the minority party representing on a conference committee. Every once in a while, the minority members on a conference committee just won't agree to any compromise because they may just not like the underlying piece of legislation, at which point there is a little maneuver called the agree to disagree, which basically allows the conference committee report to be approved of only by 4 lawmakers instead of 6. So there are some quirks of the process. Basically, at any point in the process, there are maneuvers that can be pulled that are kind of loopholes to get around the official process of getting a bill through. These get trickier and happen more during those deadlines, especially leading up to conference committee week, because people want to get their legislation through. So one that is particularly tricky is called the gut and go. And what this means is the original contents of a bill are completely stripped, either because that bill's contents have already been put into another bill, because that bill wasn't going to be acted on, or some other reason. And then the contents of another existing bill get put into that bill, and so that bill's number now has completely new contents. So an example of this was last year there was a bill, House Bill 2344, that had to do with tourism. It went over to the Senate side, where the Senate stripped the contents of that bill and put the contents of Senate Bill 282 into it, and it became a bill about childcare deregulations. When that happens, the bill title changes to Senate Substitute 4 or House Substitute 4 original bill number. So this can happen in normal committee or in conference committee, and that is more often where it happens, less so on the Senate or House floor. There are also substitute bills that are not necessarily gut and go bills. So if a bill is, quote, substantially changed, it can become a Senate substitute bill. And you might hear sometimes people talking about shells. And when people are looking for shells, they are looking for those bills that they can strip the contents of to put one or more pieces of legislation into them. Sometimes in conference committees, multiple pieces of legislation will be put into one bill. This often happens in tax committees, and that is referred to as bundling, where they'll put, technically, I think it's only up to 4 pieces of legislation that are allowed to go together, and then everything gets voted on at once, which can be tricky, especially if there are lawmakers who oppose one piece of legislation but like the other 3. And one other thing of note is interim committees. These happen between formal legislative sessions. These are committees that cannot actually take action on any legislation, but they often have stakeholders that are relevant to the topic at hand. For example, there's a joint committee on child welfare, and they usually make recommendations to the full legislature. Some of these are standing committees, like that joint committee. Some of them are special committees. For example, next month, there's a special committee on homelessness that's meeting, and these committees are made up of both senators and representatives. And then to get involved or just to try to follow along, the Kansas Legislature's website is a great place to start. You can find bill pages, you can find pages on individual lawmakers where you can see their committees, things that they've sponsored, their state house contact information, and then you can find committee pages as well, where you have the rules of that committee, so how you can present testimony. You can find legislation that's in that committee or that has been sponsored by that committee, and you can go back and look at past testimony that's been given in that committee. And then on YouTube, you can follow along with video or go back and watch. You could go watch the entire 2023 legislative session on video if you wanted on YouTube. And they stream, oh, got close to the mic. They stream chamber floors and committees live while happening. And then if you follow the hashtag KSLeg on X, formerly known as Twitter, during the session, you can also stay up to date. There are some people, particularly in the education space, who stay tweeting quite a lot. And then if you want to take action yourself, there's probably an organization in Kansas working on the issue you care about, whether it's education or the environment or healthcare. There's probably an organization that's going to have more direct actions that you can take. And then if you're interested in KAC, we have a newsletter and several resources on our website. And that is all I have. So Let me get this out of the way. Okay, thank you, everyone.
I think I'm going to try plugging in. Okay. All right. Hello, everybody. Hello at home. Where did you look? So, my name is Tim Graham. I work for KNEA. I'm one of two directors of government relations. I have a professional partner that does the kind of the election side of things, and I do some of more of the coalitions building, and we both tackle the legislative process. So one of the things that we were asked to do, by the way, in case you don't know who KNEA is, we are a member-driven organization of teachers and other education professionals in our public school system. We are the teachers union. In Kansas, there's about 40,000 educators in our public schools, and we represent as dues-paying members about 23,000 of those, but we're also proud to say that we represent everybody on their contract negotiations, salary. So oftentimes when somebody says or finds out what I do for a living, they say, get me that raise. They think we can get it at the legislative level. Actually, it happened in a local district through contract negotiations and hardworking people within our bargaining unit. So we've been asked to talk a little bit about the local school board elections, and then I will transition into just some high-level education stuff that I believe that we saw last year and that I believe we'll see in the next legislative session. So I want to kind of tell this story. The stage has really been set. In case you're not paying attention, I wouldn't blame you if you weren't. But the stage has been set for these local school board races to be tremendous political fights. It used to be that way. School board elections were always nonpartisan. They took place in April with the municipal elections, city council, county commission, mayoral, all the different things that were considered nonpartisan. But back in 2015, the Kansas Legislature passed legislation that moved all these municipal elections into November. The original bill actually made them partisan elections. That part of the bill didn't make it to the governor's desk. So even though they're not official partisan elections, and what I mean by that is you don't have a party behind your name. You're just, your name is on the ballot, and it doesn't say whether you're a Democrat, Republican, Independent, or anything like that. So at least that part stayed out of that legislation. But even though the ballot is a nonpartisan election, technically still, having it in November, in my opinion, puts it straight in the middle of the partisan process and the election cycle, and it becomes real clear what camp each candidate is. And so it's kind of like a full-fledged political fight at these school level races that never used to exist, right? So both sides have been using the school board. When I say both sides, we've got two major parties in the United States, and you know who I'm talking about. But both sides have been using the school board elections for years to kind of build their bench, start at the lower level to try to, find people that would be good candidates for higher office. And so it's always been kind of considered, the starting block, if you will, for a number of higher elected offices. But again, it was never as partisan as it is now. Both sides made relevant arguments about the pros and the cons of moving those elections to November. And make no mistake, both sides were very self-serving on this issue. The party that wanted the status quo, which was in April, they benefited from that, right? The party that wanted to move it to November, they benefit from having November partisan elections. And look, that's just the way it is. Neither side was 100% right or 100% wrong on that. But what we have now is full-fledged partisan fights at the school board elections. So the first big step in making these elections to be the intense battleground they were was the passage of that law, right? So it just basically infused a tremendous partisan cloud over the whole process. And the other thing that's really what I would say unfortunate about the process is while other elections are governed by state laws that require reporting of expenditures, reporting of contributions, the local school board elections are kind of the Wild West of elections. Yes, they have to, they do have a $500 limit on what they're allowed to receive. And yes, they're supposed to report that to the county elections office. They don't report it to the Secretary of State or the Kansas Governmental Ethics like the other candidates do. They report it to the local election offices. And I can tell you that if you happen to be living in a county that has never seen one of these reports before, a lot of times the county clerk will say, "What is this? I've never seen this." So yes, there are $500 limits to this, but there's nothing that prohibits me, if I was a school board official or I was running for the school board, to partner with somebody that wants to spend $100,000 on my race and say and do anything that they want to say in that election. And you're starting to see kind of that type of partisanship again creep into the local or the local school board race. So the second thing that really made these school races, these school board races, intense is the fact that we went through a pandemic that really put a lot of pressure on the local school system, local school boards, the public schools. Parents felt like that they were being locked out of schools, and in times they were being asked not to come because of the safety situations that were involved with the pandemic. But a lot of this stuff was probably just emotions that kind of boiled over, and now we have these tremendously again partisan and nasty races that you probably didn't see 10 or 15 years ago at the local level. We've got a lot of national groups that are spending a ton of money on third-party expenditures, and all I can say is, I would encourage everybody to pay real close attention to who the people are that are running these races. I'm not going to sit up here and endorse anybody or recommend anybody, but I will say that it's extremely important nowadays that in the local school board races, that everybody pays really close attention to who's running and what they're saying, and just ask yourself, what would you want that local school board to do? What is their job? And as the individual that's running, are they talking about things that you think are outside of the purview of a regular school board? If they are, then I would say that's a red flag. Here's my fear about the elected, about this becoming as nasty as it become at the local school board level. For a long time, this was one of the last positions that was considered a real volunteer position. These folks that were in the local school boards, they were volunteers. They didn't get paid then. They don't get paid now. A lot of the other elected officials get paid. Some of them get paid a pretty significant wage. Local school board officials don't. And so when you've got, when you've got parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles and public servants that are willing to put themselves out there and be involved in what's now an intense battleground, you've got a likelihood of people saying, heck with it, I'm not running again. And then what you've got in these elected, what you'll have in these elected offices are people that are just young politicos that want to be something and not do something. So that's my biggest fear about that. Now, again, I will say this: I've seen a lot of people start their political career as fire-breathing partisans, and they get into the job and they become responsible leaders. I've seen that happen to people on both sides of the aisle. So there is hope, but these situations and these state board elections or local board elections are tremendously important and are getting tremendously hot. So I'll take questions about that later. I will move into some high-level issues as it relates to education issues in the legislature. School funding issues are always at the top when you're talking about schools and you're talking about legislative action. Kansas has a very well thought out school funding formula that was in place from about 1992 to 2014. And then in 2015, the legislature repealed that school formula and they replaced it with 2-year block grants that just all went to the districts. Wasn't very popular. We ended up back in court, the state did. And as a result of legislative action and of basically court mandates, in 2017, the legislature enacted or basically repealed the block grant funding scheme and went back to a weighted funding formula that met the Kansas Supreme Court's mandate. So what do I mean by weighted? So school funding, basically, we have what's called a base state aid, and then we have a bunch of weighted formulas that are put into that formula as an overall package. So you'll have things like at-risk weighting. Those are students that are considered at risk. You've got low enrollment weighting for the districts that have low enrollment. You have high density at risk. You have I don't think it's called high enrollment, but it basically is high enrollment weightings. You have transportation weightings for people that live more than 2.5 miles away from where they go to school. You have special ed. You have a number of things that go into the weightings that end up being part of the calculation for what each school district has at the end of the day and how much money is sent from the state. You also have an option to have a local option budget. That is money that you all see in your property taxes and your property tax bill. Most of that money goes to the local school district. And you can see that just by bringing up your property tax. So one of the things that in 2017, one of the things they put in the new school finance formula is a consumer price index adjustment, which is to begin next year. So that consumer price index is to be a 3-year average of Midwest states. Now that average tends to be slightly lower than some of the states outside of the Midwest, but still it comes with a pretty heavy price tag. So when you're talking about increasing school funds, it always becomes a hot issue in the legislature. So that will be an issue. So one of the things that some members of the legislature want to do, they want to take that CPI out of the funding formula. They want to do that through legislative action. That would be considered, or that would be, we would consider that a funding cut to education, and others would as well. So that's the CPI provision that was passed in 2017 has been a big point of contention in the legislature and will probably be the target of some sort of legislative action in this coming session. Special education funding is also going to be huge. I'm not going to do a very good job of articulating this because it is so complicated, but state law sets the reimbursement rate for SPED funding by the state to be at 92% of what the excess costs are. And I'll try here in a second to explain what excess costs are, but I will tell you right now that currently the state only pays the excess cost at about 70%. So by 2025, we're looking at about a $225 million shortfall. So the excess costs are basically calculated by the Kansas Department of Education, and it's complicated, but let me try to make it as simple as I can. You take the total expenditures that go into that formula that I talked about. You take the per pupil cost of regular education, and you take that out. You take federal SPED funding out. You take all Medicaid reimbursements out, and what's left, that's the excess cost of special education. And what's left, we are supposed to be funding 92% of that amount. But like I said earlier, the state only funds about 70% of that. So what happens? Well, basically what happens is that money doesn't get to the school districts, and school districts aren't able to hire as many special education teachers as they need and paraprofessionals as they need in classrooms to fully fund special education. So here's the deal. Again, oftentimes when the legislative body is having a hard time coming to an agreement on something like this, instead of really sitting down and talking about a compromise, they want to move the goalpost. So we'll see this year there will be some legislators that will say, well, we're already funding special education well beyond 92. And they'll take the formula and some of the things. Again, it's a very complicated equation, but they'll take some aspects of what are being funded at certain corners of the full funding formula. That's bad. And what they're going to do is they're going to have to change state law in a bunch of different areas to make sure that they tweak that 90% figure. So I don't know if that will be something that they'll be successful in doing, but that'll certainly be big on the list this year. Now, there will also be people that'll just say, let's fund special ed. Let's fully fund special ed. The State Board of Ed Education proposed a 4-year, $86 million per year fix that would bring us up to about that $225 shortfall that we're going to see in 2025. But again, some other legislators are already there, we're already funding it. It's just not being counted appropriately. So let's change a couple areas of the law and then get the credit where credit's due, and we'll fix it just like that. Other people will say that the feds aren't paying what they need to pay, and that's correct. The feds have, they're allowed to pay up to, I think, 40% of special ed through ESSER funds, and they're only paying about 17% of the excess cost of what they could actually get. So the feds are, it's what we call them from the federal level. So one thing that some legislators will do is say, well, we'll fund special ed when the feds do. Okay, but in the meantime, we're not properly funding the classrooms the way they need to be. So one other thing I wanted to say about that. Oh yeah, so here's the other thing you need to know about special ed. One of the reasons why it's been so hard to increase funding is once the money goes in from a federal perspective, that money can't come out. It's called maintenance of effort. So once the money goes in, the money that I talked about that the feds aren't sending us, they do send us, I think they're sending us about $105 million a year. Or I think that's the price tag that they are supposed to. I have it in my bag. Anyways, here's the deal. If we put the money in and we take it out, then the feds will take out an equal number in the next year. So you don't have to really worry about getting sued, but what the feds will do is they say, let's say you put in $29 million in the next fiscal year, and then the fiscal year after that, you take that 29 out, then what you'll see is the feds taking out about the same, because what they don't want is they don't want to increase their funding of special ed and allow the states to drop down their funding. So it gets very complicated. And again, one of the easiest fixes is just to tweak the numbers and say we're already paying for it. And that's going to be something that'll be a legislative proposal that will take place, or that they'll try this year. So some other things that we have to think about when we're looking at revenue streams or looking at school funding, we've got to look at the revenue streams. Let me just throw something out at you. The state is flush with cash reserves right now. All 125 members of the House, all 40 members of the Senate are up for election in 2024. So if you add all that up, you got tax breaks or tax cuts as political fodder to be proposed in the next legislative session. There's no getting around it. They will likely pass some sort of tax cut. It'll likely be what's called a flat tax. They did that last year. Governor Kelly vetoed it. And I'll just say this, school funding advocates are pretty wary of tax proposals because of what we've been through in the last 15 years, when we had some really big unforced errors, caused a great financial crisis by going too far on the tax cuts. And given the fact that school funding comprises about 60% of the we're very wary about legislators going too far. So we'll definitely keep our eyes on that. Some other things you'll see, and I'm starting to wrap up here. You'll see all the latest kind of culture war, political battles, stuff that's coming from the top down. You'll see bathroom bills, you'll see overnight accommodations bills, you'll see transgender athlete bans. You're going to see a big fight on a so-called Parents' Bill of Rights. You're going to see bans on certain diversity and inclusion programs. And again, it's all has to do with, I would say, a small group of legislators that want to push this sort of agenda, I think, because it's an election. So there'll be a number of those things that will pop up in the legislative process this year. Now, the last thing that I'm talking about, what I want to talk about, is something where I see a silver lining in kind of the legislative, what seems to be a legislative cloud sometimes, and that's CAPERS, the Kansas Public Employees Retirement System. So there is widespread agreement amongst all political flavors, if you will, conservatives, progressives, moderates on the left, moderates on the right, if any of those flavors still exist. But there's widespread agreement that Tier 3 is, CAPERS is woefully inadequate. So let me tell you what Tier 3 is. About 10 years ago, the state was in one of those dire financial messes that we found ourselves in. And in order to save money and in order really to save CAPERS, they had a reform bill. And what they did is they created a third tier for CAPERS employees. And that third tier was for any new hire after January 2015. And that Tier 3 is tremendously inadequate. It's worse than what your average person would get from Social Security. And the biggest group of people in Tier 3 are teachers. So again, we're talking about a profession that having trouble recruiting and retaining individuals in. And we can't, with a straight face, go out there and say, hey, become a teacher, you're going to have a great pension. We could say that 25 years ago. We can't say that now. And one legislator I talked to told me he was hard-pressed to believe that we could use that as a tool in the recruitment and retention toolbox. And I said, well, possibly, and basically what he was saying was most young people going into a profession aren't thinking about retirement. And that's true. I know from my own perspective, I didn't think about retirement when I started in my career. However, if we have parents and financial mentors and guardians that they're doing their job, then they're definitely saying, hey, you need to pay attention to your pension. And so we don't know whether that can be a tool in our recruitment and retention toolbox because we don't even have it. So why not create the tool and see if it works and see if we can start bringing more people into the education system. So again, the great thing about this is that we have just a whole host of legislators in every corner of the political spectrum that want to work on CAPERS. That's a good thing. That is a really good thing. And it could be an ice-breaking type of situation because this, if they pull this off, this is a big deal. And this is an example of where people can work together on issues that actually matter. If they were able to do away with Tier 3 and move everybody that's currently on Tier 3 into Tier 2, you would almost effectively double a teacher's pension overnight. So that's how important this is. I'm hopeful that we'll see something along those lines in the legislative session of 2024. There will be a whole host of other issues, and the CAPERS fight itself won't be without some culture war stuff. There's it's called economic and social governance provisions, where if there's a company that has decided that they are going to invest in like a clean energy portfolio, then there's, or maybe an anti-gun portfolio or a more progressive portfolio. There are individuals in the legislature that want to basically compel CAPERS to divesting from those companies immediately, right? So we, KNEA didn't really get into the whole argument of whether that was good or bad, but we had to definitely take a look at the bills as they were written and say, what is the effect of your ESG bill? And if your effect is to blow an $800 million hole in the Capers Trust Fund, then that's probably not a very good idea. So we'll have that fight. We'll have the fight over, when I say we, I'm just talking about all of us collectively. This will be a debate in the legislature. There also will be a debate about divesting from so-called enemies of the state. The United States has about 8 countries on the adversary list: China, Cuba, Venezuela, Russia, others. And again, there was a bill last session that in the middle of all this talk of reform was going to make Capers divest from any companies that had major holdings within those countries, almost do it overnight. And again, we're talking $700-800 million hole that they were going to blow in the Capers budget. Something that we could set back in. So those are some of the high level issues as they relate to education and educators. Last year, we began tracking probably 185 bills. Obviously, we didn't follow all those bills through the process because a lot of them stopping point at somewhere along the way. But there will be a ton of issues, and there'll probably be a few that I can't even imagine. But that's kind of where we set, and appreciate you guys inviting me here and letting us talk about it.
I have a couple of questions if I can remember them. One of them has to do, where does the whole issue of free lunches come into play with your work? Is that something that you're dealing with legislatively?
Yeah, I can go, and then Tim, if you have any insight. So for people who don't know, during the pandemic, the federal government enacted some legislation that basically gave the United States Department of Agriculture a waiver to provide school meals for free to all students in schools who have the National School Lunch and Breakfast Program operating. That ended, the last year of that was the 21-22 school year. And since then, a lot of states, well, not a lot, 9 states have passed legislation that either temporarily or permanently institutes a state level universal free meal program, free school meal program. In Kansas, that has not happened. There have been several districts that have instituted things like free breakfast. I think Hayes recently instituted free breakfast for all students. The issue is that states would be responsible for the difference between what the USDA reimburses based on how many students qualify for free and reduced price lunch, and what usually parents and students are required to pay to make up that difference. I don't know if there will be legislation introduced in Kansas to try to move us to free school meals. There are some kind of stair-step options that the state could take. There's a program called Community Eligibility Provision, where schools with a certain percentage of students who would qualify for free or reduced price lunch can make meals free for all students. But again, that tends to come at a cost to the school district. So not sure really where that's going to go on the state level. Do you have anything to add?
Okay. Another question. When you were talking about papers, it was reminded me of, in the toolkit, it was reminding me of some metrics I know I've seen recently about the state of Kansas, where we have so many people who get educated in Kansas and immediately leave the state. I mean, how can these toolkits be improved so that we can, retain some people in the state, I guess, is my question. And also, are legislators aware of why people leave the state?
There's no short answer, or there's no, I guess the way I should say this, there's no lack of opinion on why people are leaving the state. And of course, one side likes to blame the other side, right? And so it's this vicious cycle of debate instead of really sitting down and talking about it. I know there was a legislative, there was a lobbyist before one of the education committees a couple years ago that got up and said that 40% of people were leaving the state so they could go and go to a state that had school choice, AKA vouchers, which, by the way, will be another big issue this year. And then it was asked, who did the survey? And I think his answer was it was just a moving company that had asked some of their clients why they were leaving, and there was really no connection to the public school system. He had kind of put that into the answer himself. So the other question you had was, again, just kind of goes back to the story I told you earlier. We don't know whether it can be a tool because it's not a tool that we have right now. But I would think history would indicate that when CAPERS was considered top of the line pension system, it's been around since 1962. When it was considered a top of the line pension system, we didn't have the same sort of teacher shortages that we have now. Now, again, there's a lot of things that have changed since then. So there's plenty of blame to go around. But I certainly think that we have to give ourselves that tool in order to see if it works, and I think it will.
I would just add that a lot of lawmakers will say that taxes are the reason that people leave the state. They go to states where they have lower property taxes, lower income taxes, and there has been some really robust research that shows that that's not really true, especially for people, younger families. Education is often a reason people leave the state, cost of healthcare, those kinds of things. But like Tim said, it's a very complicated answer. But there are definitely, lawmakers, I think, on both sides of the aisle, and organizations working on kind of figuring out what the right fix is, or combination of fixes, rather.
What sort of legislative ideas are being considered in efforts for recruiting and retaining teacher talent in the state of Texas? Or excuse me, sorry, I say that we're from Texas, in Kansas.
Well, again, pay is always an issue, but that's a issue that takes place on the local level, right? But I think we have to look at the pension system as a recruitment tool and a retention tool, because if you have a state that offers a better retirement program, then it's very easy to leave at some point and go to that state. So I think that's one of the most critical things. Now, there's a lot of other things. We like to talk about the fact that many of our teachers feel attacked on a regular basis by our legislature. And I think a lot of that is just a breakdown of communication that we're trying really hard to fix. But that certainly is something that we're trying to do. I'm a broken record when it comes to relationship building. And so in the years that I've worked in this process, I've seen two highway programs take place, 10-year comprehensive highway plans take place. The folks that build the highways, they're at the table. They've got an association. It's called the Kansas Contractors Association. and they are right in the middle of every highway transportation plan. They get to talk about what works for them and what doesn't. When we privatized Medicaid and the managed care companies came to the state, they were part of the bill that basically was written to privatize that system. Okay, they were there to talk about what worked for them. When we did sports wagering here a couple years ago, the casino companies or the casinos had an unprecedented amount of influence on those. But when it comes to bills that affect our educators and our teachers, we have to react and respond all the time. We find out everything on Twitter, on social media, or in the newspaper. We don't even have newspapers anymore, do they? But the news. We are very seldomly are we ever brought in on the ground floor and say, hey, what do you think your members would think about this? So again, you want to make teachers feel respected, and you want to retain them and make them feel like they're welcome in the state, and start bringing them to the table in this legislative process. And if it's not happening, figure out why. And from my perspective, we're working hard to change what we need to change on our end, and we're asking legislators to do the same.
Okay, I gut and go. Explain why that's so popular. I mean, is it farther along in the process when they do it, so they don't have to go through all the committees? Is that why it's popular?
So it can be done early in the process, but there's very little reason to, because earlier in the process, kind of more bills have more of a chance of getting through. I think some of it is to skip over some points of the process, because if you have a bill that's gone through the Senate process, but it hasn't gone through the House, but then you plug it into a House shell, it's now a House bill, and it kind of skips some steps. And then yeah, and then in conference committees, it often happens just so that you can put multiple bills together. They just need a place to bundle all of those bills together, and that's where it happens. I think, this is a bit more of a cynical view. I think one sometimes benefit to lawmakers is that maybe legislation that is less popular can get put with legislation that is popular,
Right.
or legislation that the governor would be more likely to veto is put with legislation that the governor really wants. And so then it makes it a harder choice. There's more political messaging that can happen around that.
Now, in terms of bills that are introduced, are most of them done by individual legislature here in the state of Kansas? Or do most of them come outside from, like, I think there's a Republican organization called ALEC, I think. Is that where most of, I won't put an adjective in front of that, bills come from?
I think it depends. I'm in the area where I work, which is food security type of things. There is a similar organization that's based in Florida that tends to have sort of template bills that go to
Right.
various states.
Exactly.
That I think that does happen a good amount. And then there are a good number of bills that come from lawmakers who have heard from their constituents that say, like, we need this specific thing fixed. I think that unfortunately those get a little bit less airtime than the ones that you're talking about. But Tim, what do you think?
No, I would agree. There's a healthy mix of the genesis of these bills. There's certainly the template bills that Erin talks about, and they get all the attention. They're used as a lot of times as just political fodder. Both sides have a tendency of doing that, and that's another one of the reasons why I've been around the process for 25 years. I've seen the process break down. Because it used to be legislators getting together and talking about ideas, working together to come up with something, and then battling it out, fighting it out if need be, but being able to be agreeable after the fact. But now you've got think tanks that are involved, and not only are they heating up the rhetoric around these bills. They're ruining relationships by conditioning people to believe that we're supposed to be enemies. And so it's a lot worse than it used to be.
Ben, kind of along that same line, has Moms for Liberty made an appearance here in Kansas yet? Okay, I've read some stories online, but I hadn't heard of a group here in Kansas yet trying to influence school board elections. Okay, here's my last question. My son's a teacher, and you know, I read a lot in the paper about the funding and all that, and of course here in Lawrence, of course, there's a big deal about improving pay for teachers and benefits and such. The way I look at it, I don't see how the way we fund schools now is ever going to be sufficient to fund teachers at a level where they need to be. Is there any talk about doing like means-based fees or anything which people have to pay, or anything which schools can actually generate more income other than just begging for tax increases and such?
Sure, there's talk about fees all the time. There's always talk about unique funding sources. But look, public schools are one of the basic tenets of the American experiment, right? I mean, it goes back to Jefferson, Madison, and all those folks, and we have the money to fund schools. We just don't do it. And so I don't know that you know, the means-based fees get a lot of traction in certain segments of the legislature, because at the same time that you might talk about that, we're talking about a huge tax break for some multinational company that doesn't really need it, and it's being called eco-devo. So.
Just need to lobby our legislators and hope that come some of that $3 billion surplus to the schools.
Well, yeah, but here's the deal. So I may sound a little bit negative, but I in all the talk, when I talk about all the breakdown in communications, the one thing that I'm seeing, and it gives me hope, is that I really don't think that there's as many anti-public education, anti-teacher legislators as some groups would like you to believe, right? And so one party has decided that they're the party of education, and they've done a really good job of marketing that. But the other party, if they are communicated with, and if those relationships are built over the course of time, I think you can start seeing some good things happen along those lines, and it doesn't have to be as divisive. But when money's involved, there's always groups out there that think that there's a better use of that money, and that's what causes all the infighting.
I would just quickly add on to that if you live in Lawrence, your representatives and senators are probably, depending on where you stand on things like school funding, they may likely already be with you. But there are, communities across the state that maybe could use help, could use voices, resources to help get in touch with their lawmakers. There's also always legislative leadership to reach out to and say, this is the kind of thing that we want to hear heard on the Senate floor or the House floor.
Hi, I'm here to give a shameless plug to Educate Lawrence. We are a local advocacy group. We were formed in 2015 by then Superintendent Dr. Dole, and we are loosely affiliated with, USD 497. We use their legislative priorities as ours. We also collaborate with advocacy groups throughout the state. And yes, we do have representatives and senators in Lawrence, but we're also, Douglas County, and Douglas County was broken into like 5 different districts for our representatives. And so there's a lot of work that we can do even closer to home. Thank you. Oh, bit.ly/Ed Lawrence, and you can read more. Thank you.
I did have one more question. We moved here from Pennsylvania. And when I got here, I kept hearing about, there was a certain process in a state like Missouri where they were able to put something on to be voted on. And they had a Medicaid situation where they wanted to pass Medicaid because the legislators wouldn't do that. Do we have a process like that in Kansas?
Finney governor.
Yeah, I'm not sure when, but unfortunately that is not a tool at our disposal. And I think a lot of things would have happened in Kansas that haven't if we had ballot measures. Ballot measures.
Thank you.
Does anyone have any final questions before we say adieu for the evening? Okay, then let's give one more thank you to our presenters for being here today. Thanks, everybody.